For those who don't know PhotoWings, please check it. It's a very important nonprofit organization who's devoted significant energy and funds to create a free content. And same as us at VII Foundation and VII Academy, we believe that education should be free whenever possible. And today, education in the field of photography, as you probably know, is extremely expensive, be that in the States or Europe. It remains largely inaccessible to many of us. I was lucky to live and to study in a country where education is free, but there was no photo education. Anyway, today we are joined by Justin Stailey, Senior Manager of Product Development at Fuji North America. And today, Justin and myself, we will be talking about physics of photography. I think we try to keep artist talks and technical talks separated, just because it's easier to focus on one or the other. But I guess photography is unique in that sense. Well, it's unique in many senses, but it's very unique because there is a direct relationship between our final product, photography or video, and tools we use. And Justin will also obviously mention it. Just photography, as much as anything else, is a craft. And I think a lot of younger folks who missed the whole film era sometimes don't get it. Nowadays, thankfully, thanks to technology, algorithms, processors, and so on, are doing a huge chunk of job for us. So all those who missed the joys and frustrations of working in film, I feel that every now and then we need to address the technical aspect of photography, which is what we're going to do in two sessions with Justin. And Justin, I would like to hand it over to you. Just another housekeeping rule for our audience. Please feel free to ask any questions concerning photography and concerning Fuji, which Justin and I will try to answer to our best. So please use Q&A box and fire your questions as we go, and then I will aggregate those questions for Justin. And this session, we are not longer broadcasting on Facebook. We feel this is a better way to broadcast, but all of you who registered, this is recorded, so all of those who have registered will receive a recording should they like to view it again. Justin, thank you very much for joining us. I'm actually very excited because I myself am a little bit technical nerd, and I have been lucky to go through all the contemporary phases of photography, including I was long time a dedicated, committed film person, but obviously for the past 10 years I have switched to digital. Anyway, we'll get to that in no time. Justin, thank you very much, and the digital floor is yours.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for coming in and joining us. I'm just going to take a moment here, and if I can share my screen, I was just going to show a couple slides and we can talk about some things, but I think you made some really interesting points there. And you and I were kind of chatting beforehand and talking about different concepts and different things. And I don't want to jump the gun on what I'm talking about, but the physics of photography with Fujifilm, I mean, this is looking at the tools that you use. Digital cameras kind of are the thing now. And today, really what we're going to talk about a lot is cameras themselves, and cameras in film and digital, and types of cameras and functioning of cameras. And so these are kind of my topics today: different types of cameras, pros and cons of each, how your camera sees, and how to determine what's right for you and for your shoot, right? So this is kind of my topics for today. And something you said earlier, photography is a craft, and I truly believe that. I started photography in the 90s in film. I black and white zone system. I was taught by people that were taught by Minor White and Walker Evans and photographers like that in history. So I learned all of those things, all of that craft. And to me, that's really important. I use the word craft a lot. And to me, I use that term because to me, photography is a curious amalgam of science and art, right? There's science, the technology, the gear. It's knowing how to make these things work for you, knowing a certain film and a certain developer can give me really small, tight grain, or another developer might give me grain the size of golf balls. And how can I use that technology to do that? And in art is the creativity, right? And there's no right or wrong answer. There's no right or wrong mix. Beautiful art can come out of both. And if you look at famous photographers, Dorothea Lange, a friend of mine, was Dorothea Lange's printer after he got out of the Navy. And the migrant mother, the famous image of the migrant mother, that negative is so thin that he used to joke that it was through her sheer willpower that that image exists. That because her will and her desire to capture that and her passion and everything about her just made that picture come together and made it what it is. So that's really kind of where we're going and what we want to talk about. And I think the craft and some of the science talk, we're going to try to keep it at a nice level, a nice pace. And we've already got one of these scheduled in the books for next month on optics and lenses. So we'll talk about that a little bit, and that'll dive into equivalencies and some other crazy stuff that gets misunderstood and talked about incorrectly a lot. But today we're going to sort of dive in there and talk a little about types of cameras. And if we have questions, please dump them in there. Would love to hear them. I love back and forth. I love talk. So and debate and everything else. So if you have questions, if there's something you want to know more about, definitely we can bring it up in a future episode or a future conversation. But I'm happy to help in any way, shape, or form I can.
Well, I have a question from
Sure.
the beginning. So this is the first time, by the way, that we are having a camera producer, well, representative of a camera manufacturer in front of us. So I'm just curious, and I apologize in advance if it's naive, but I like to be naive in some things. I'm just curious, how does this whole transition from, and obviously Fuji being a film stock producer, being camera producer, lenses, and the whole 360 degree company that manufactures everything that involves photography and video. I'm just curious how this transition was seen from your perspective, from large format. And I was a huge fan of Fuji quick loads for 4x5, and actually I sold all my 4x5 inches cameras as soon as you stopped producing the quick loads. So yeah, I blame you for that. I'm just curious, how does company, I was very sad. That was like truly sad, like really sad day for me, because it was one of brilliant inventions. Anyway, I'm just curious, how does this transition from film, from something that's very bulky, complicated, involves chemistry, alchemy, if you like, at some point, and transitioning to this to fully digital? I'm just curious, how does that look from your perspective? Is it just about advancement of technology and making money, which there's nothing wrong if it is, but I'm just curious from your perspective, how do you see this?
I mean, that's to me really interesting. And us as a company is kind of unique because we're the only company that kind of had a foot in the chemistry and the science of silver photography. 1938 roughly is when they started producing. Fujifilm was one of the early names. Started producing black and white film and then color film. And it wasn't in the US, at least it wasn't until the 50s that they even had a presence in North America. And then 84 Olympics, Fujifilm took over the Olympic sponsorship that year. And then it sort of all changed where we started to come and have this different presence in at least the Western world. And it's really kind of interesting, but I would say us as a company is unique, right? We as a company are very diverse. If you look up Fujifilm and look up how many companies are under Fujifilm, you'll see that we still have lots of other companies and that we have pharmaceutical companies and we have chemical manufacturers. We make lots of things. We basically saw the end of film coming by the decline in sales. So around 2004 was the peak year of film. And then so falling off after that. And now, film total global production and global consumption is probably about 1%. of what it was in 2004. So it's a different game, different ball game. So how do you deal with that? How do you adapt and overcome? What we did as a company is took a lot of those core science that we had with coating technologies, so coating film, and took that into coating inkjet paper and coating sensors and doing all kinds of things. And so it just really, we adapted as a company and looked at different ways that technology could transition and be used. And I mean, we partner with lots of people. We have a really cool place that if you ever get to Tokyo, you can make an appointment and go in there and see it. There's also one in Europe and there's one in California in the US called our Open Innovation Hub. And it's kind of a little bit of a science fair, science museum, almost like a kid's science museum, except they don't want you to touch the stuff. And so usually I go in there and I get in trouble because I start touching things. But it's really about our core technologies and a lot of the things that we've done over the years and that we still continue to do and how it's used. And so we created these centers to build partnerships and to look for other companies that are looking for technologies. Just as a quick example, anyone out there remember the early flat screen TVs or flat screen monitors or even flat screen computer screens on a laptop, right? You had to sit right in front of it. If you sat at an angle and looked at it, it got dark and got hard to see, but you had to sit right in front of it. Well, now that's all changed, right? You can look at it at many different angles. Well, that's actually a thin layer of film that we developed that goes on there that helps to diffuse the pixels in the display to make the angle that you can view at increase. So that's just one example of the many things that we've done and that we do in everyday life. Touchscreens. There's actually a layer of film on a touch screen that makes it so that your finger completes the circuit, right? That's how those work. We have a lot of the patents on that kind of stuff, that we actually make the layers of film that go into devices that are used as touchscreen panels. So we've taken and transitioned some of that technology and thin layers of coating and chemical process and transition into other things. So the transition into pharmaceutical companies, well, we were making really pure silver for photography. We were making very pure dyes for color film. So what other uses of that? So having really pure chemistry, we started looking at making pharmaceuticals, making other things to make the world a better place. And if you have an Epson printer at home, the actual cartridges with your pigments in them, we actually make the pigments that are in your Epson printer. So there's lots of things that we do and that are different and touch lots of different industries. I'll try to find it. There's a really cool video that my European colleagues did 2 years ago or so on their 50th anniversary that talks about how Fujifilm touches your life every day by our technology and things that we do, whether it's X-ray technology at the doctor's office to photography to other things. It's really kind of backup camera in your car. A lot of that technology is things that we've done over the years. So it's really kind of a broad-based company.
Got it.
Sorry for the long-winded answer.
No. I think it's in a way it's also a condensed history class of photography.
Yeah.
At least when it comes to technology.
But it's really cool, and it's something that maybe we look at in the future. We can talk about is the way cameras respond to color, right? Yes. And looking at that, and we actually have engineers. The engineer, I've met the gentleman who developed Velvia 50 slide film and is responsible for the color palette of Velvia 50. Well, he works on our film simulations. So he's actually transitioned from working in a silver environment to now he consults and helps craft the way our cameras see color.
Huh.
So you can have some really cool conversations with these guys about what are they trying to do. And if you talk to our engineers, they talk about two different types of color. They talk about colorimetric color and they talk about memory color. And the colorimetric color is pretty straightforward, right? You take a picture of something, you want the red to match the red. So I photograph my teacup. I want this red to be the same red that this teacup actually is. And that's great, right? Reproduce exactly what's there. But then they talk about memory color. It's one of the goals that they had, particularly for a lot of consumer film, was when you went on vacation and you had to wait to get your film back. Right, so you shot slides, you had to send it off, wait to get it back, or even prints. Unless you went to a 1-hour lab, you had to wait for it to come back. Well, how did your memory see it? How does your eye see color and light? versus the way your camera sees color and light. So they were always wrestling with this. And so a film like Velvia, right? Velvia always has those rich blue skies, the grass is green. And, you know, so that was kind of the inspiration for that film, was to that hyper reality was really more about how your mind sees it, how your mind sees the color and your memory sees color. So, you know, if you go on a vacation to Hawaii, the water's always blue, the sand is always beautiful white, the palm trees are green, the grass is beautiful green, right? All those things fit into play. And that was the intent of that kind of film. So having that knowledge transition into digital is just a kind of extension of the way the company works.
Got it. So just to talk about the slide that you have on. So types of cameras. So Fuji, I don't know if you don't make film cameras anymore, correct? You're fully digital, right?
Well, it depends what you consider an Instax camera.
Yes, true. But
So,
I was more referring to medium format and so on. You're not making those anymore. So you currently, and for me that's most important, that's most interesting, but I guess it will be a long way to it. I was very surprised positively when you started making the digital medium format cameras, and I've been medium format shooter all my life basically. So I was very excited when you came up with the camera that it's only a little bit larger than, if that, from any other Canon or Nikon. So can you just guide us through in sense of where we are with the Fuji now and the formats and stuff? If that's what you had in mind with the types of cameras, of course.
Oh, well, I mean, I had a little bit of all kinds of stuff in mind. I had a little bit of history in mind, and I had a little bit of just the way cameras work and the way cameras see. But we can definitely go down any path that we want to go down. But just as a conversation point, as a company, we kind of work in two different formats. And we have our X series cameras, which use a APS-C size sensor or Super 35 from the cinema world size sensor. You know, roughly in the neighborhood of 18 by 24. It's really, you know, 16 point something by 23 point something. It's just easier to think about it as 18 by 24 roughly. We make cameras in that size with the inspiration being small, lightweight cameras, right? They really were inspired by sort of, you know, little cameras like this guy that are small, little handy cameras you can always take with you, right? And cameras, since film used to be small, they've gotten bigger in the digital world. And so that's kind of our inspiration. So when we started from scratch with the X series, so it was roughly 10 years ago, the X100, it was last fall at would have been Photokina last fall. We showed a prototype at Photokina, and then about this time of the year, the camera actually came out in the market. And it really was inspired by a rangefinder type camera. And that camera honestly was a test for us. And it was, we had gotten out of cameras. We had some partnerships with some other companies prior to that, but we had gotten out of digital cameras. We made some compact cameras, some underwater cameras, some little point and shoot cameras, but we had kind of gotten out of the camera business. And we looked at it and said, well, we're going to try this. We're going to make this concept and see what the reaction is to it. And if it failed, if no one was interested, we were going to walk away and not do digital cameras again as a professional sort of revenue stream. But it was a raving success at Photokina. Everyone was loving it. And then so that camera came out, and that just started a whole line of cameras then around that. So we started introducing the X Pro 1, which was an interchangeable lens rangefinder type camera that has a viewfinder in it, and then XT1, and just it grew the system from there. So that was that smaller system. And our engineers sat and they thought about this system a lot. Having lots of experience, we made medium format cameras for years. We made 35mm cameras for years. We had a lot of knowledge. And so the size of a camera to us was important, and the size package of the camera. So the lens, the body, all of the pieces of it, right? How does it fit together? How does it work as a single piece? And so that became really important to us. So we picked that APS-C sensor format because not so much that would make the body smaller, but because it would make the lenses smaller. And so we picked that format.
May I just jump in? I think that was a brilliant choice, because when I was switching from my film cameras to digital after Canon, because I became a little bit, I wanted to try something else. I think I tested Sony, which also went towards mirrorless and so on, but they used full frame, which ended up creating these massive lenses, which for me totally beat the purpose. You have this tiny body of Alpha series, for example, tiny body, beautiful performance, no doubt about that. But it ends up with the massive lens, the same I had on my Canon, 2470 was exactly the same, if not bigger. So for me, that was a deal breaker. And I have to say that now, because I shoot both video and film, and photos, so I have to have a double kit, including backups. So for me, really, there was no choice but to go your way. And yeah, I mean, I think that was a brilliant choice to go APS.
Well, the engineers sat down. We had no pre-existing camera system to work from. Everyone else had something else to work from. So Sony had the Minolta patents. They had the A99 and they had some SLR cameras. So they were all focused on the way those pieces went together. We instead started the blank canvas and a blank sheet of paper and said, okay, well, if we're going to build a sensor this big, here's how big the lenses need to be. And with mirrorless, yeah, having a short back distance, so having the lenses sit really close to the sensor, gives you, the designers, a lot of freedom and a lot of ability to work and change things, but it also oftentimes creates lenses that are bigger, right? And that's what you saw, that you take a full frame mirrorless camera and a typical lens that you would use, you haven't saved any size from an SLR type camera. It's basically,
and you mess up the balance as well.
Yeah, it becomes nose heavy. The lenses become, they're bigger, they're heavier. So that's sort of the problem, is balance and package. And that's why we've sort of stuck with what we're doing and how we've focused it. Like when you talk about an X100 camera, our little original camera, everything about that, when they're designing a new version of it, every thought is about keeping the size the same. And how do they keep the size down? If it adds 2 millimeters to the thickness, they question it. Is this really something we want to do? Because they want that camera to be small camera, big pictures. And so everything has that in the philosophy of it. So the lens being sunk into the body to make it smaller, to make it thin, that was part of the inspiration of that camera. So it just really depends. And that's kind of where we've been. Well, so in talking and looking at other lines, everyone's been looking at full frame, so 35 millimeter based systems. Well, if we're talking about film, there was reasons why certain size films were made, right? And I can dive into the history of Edison and one of his guys and how starting a motion picture, and that's what started 35 millimeter film. And then, the couple different companies deciding over the years to take that frame that was running vertically in a movie camera and turning it sideways so they could double the frame size to make 35 millimeter. And then standardizing that, and then 35 millimeter suddenly emerges on the marketplace, right? That revolutionized the market. It allowed the camera to be small, lightweight, compact, go anywhere. Journalism, Robert Capa, Cartier-Bresson, famous photographers like that. That's what made what they did possible, as opposed to guys out there, with big things like this, right? Covering conflict during, the Second World War, Joe Rosenthal photographing the Marines raising the flag on Iwo Jima, kind of a thing. It was possible, but there was a different feel to the photography because the cameras were big. They were slower to use. They took more effort, where you had someone like, Kappa or Cartier-Bresson running around with a little Leica that could disappear into their jacket pocket and they could be gone. No one would even know they were there almost. They were these silent observers at different locations and different things. So this to me is all part of this history and part of what makes sort of knowing about this stuff kind of special and magical to me.
And then you made large format, medium format.
Yeah, well, we started looking at that. So back to that conversation, 35 millimeter to us didn't seem like there wasn't enough advantage, right? And because we're dealing with sensors now, we're not dealing with film. So there's not pre-existing sizes, there's not anything. You can, if you're willing to spend enough money, you can go to any sensor manufacturer and get something cut custom. So there's no need to say, oh, well, we're stuck with this and we're stuck with this. Where in film days, you were stuck. There were certain widths of film, 120, 220 was the same width, just longer, right? So there's only so much space you can put on there, right? You can be a 645, a 6x6, a 6.7, 6.8, 6.9, 6.17 camera can all fit on those formats, but you're stuck to that 6 centimeters, right? Yeah, if you want to go bigger than that, you got to go to 4x5, 5x7, 8x10, and then you're down to sheets of film. Well, when we're talking about digital, we don't have those restrictions. We could make a sensor almost any size we wanted to. So it then becomes a balancing act also, like how big does the camera become? And then how big do the lenses become? So we picked a sensor size of 33 by 44. So a 4:3 aspect ratio, which is sort of a classic aspect ratio. And it allowed us to produce some pretty interesting medium format cameras at a really interesting price. I mean, the new GFX 100S comes in at about $6,000 retail for a medium format camera. That's basically the size of a DSLR. So it's a completely different equation. I have one sitting here just out of frame. To be able to have a camera that is pretty much not far off in size from a Canon or Nikon, but is a medium format sensor in there, it's really kind of an interesting piece.
So can you explain me a little bit, because I'm totally dumb when it comes to all these prices and so on. When I first bought my medium format digital camera, it was Pentax, and it was like $10,000+. So I want to know how come that, and I kind of know by intuition why is now cheaper than before, but I'd like you to sort of a little bit explain a little bit better, because it wasn't so long ago. We're not talking about 20 years, but like it's half the price, literally. So I'm just, and it's not only, it doesn't only concern Fuji, it does concern also other manufacturers, but in particular with Fuji, like how is it possible that we went from $10,000+ for a body that shoots medium format down to, well, depending on your model, but I think the cheapest one is what, $4,500, right, for the 50R or something like that, $5,000. So how did we? I need a little bit of clarification on that as a user, practitioner, and a buyer.
Okay, so when you were dealing with a film-based system, so your Pentax 645 type camera, the body was mechanical, right?
Yes.
So there was a certain amount of cost associated with manufacturing that body, because it has shutters in it, it has lens mounts, it has electronics in it, it has all those things. But still, the most expensive component on that was still the sensor.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
So take any digital camera, the most expensive component there is physically the sensor for the manufacturer.
Okay.
Right. So that's the biggest piece driving cost. So when we look at mirrorless cameras, we have basically the only moving part in these cameras is the shutter.
Okay.
So the moving parts, the engineering all changes now. It's all a completely different piece. So there's less sort of mechanical stuff that has to be made to go inside of it. Once you get the IBIS unit figured out in that production, get the shutter figured out in that production, pay for the sensor to go into a box of some kind, and then it's about quantities. Right. So reducing the price has increased the quantity of sales, which so supply and demand. It becomes less expensive because the numbers that get sold into the marketplace.
Okay.
So, I mean, to me, it's fantastic. And that's always been our goal with the GFX, was to bring down the price of medium format back so that it was an accessible price point. Because it's our heritage. Our heritage is a lot of medium format cameras. We wanted to bring that back. We see a reason to have it. We see that, those large sensors do a lot of things for photographers.
Absolutely.
So how do we do that back? How do we bring that back to them at a point where we're not much more expensive in the new GFX 100S than a full frame professional, like a D5, D6 type camera, or an EOS 1D, whatever the current version is of that camera. We're about kind of the same price point. So it's really kind of an interesting kind of period in history right now that the cost has come back down and is much closer. It's kind of like it was in the film days, where getting into a Hasselblad system was kind of the same as you would have spent on an F4 Nikon when it was brand new. So it's kind of an interesting balance right now, but that mechanical labor and everything else, it's why certain brands are particularly expensive, right? There's a certain German-made camera company that makes beautiful cameras, but they're so expensive because of the amount of labor and the cost of that labor to actually put it together, and the mechanical nature of it requires so much work and effort to produce. I used to work for that company, so I can speak to their production line and everything else.
And what you just said, actually, in a way, I always like to say that photography is probably most democratic medium, and I think digital, and if we're going to go further, the Fuji medium format made medium format as democratic as possible. So I think what digital technology did for us, other than being able to see results of our work instantly, which is obviously huge, I think what it really did for photography and photojournalism, because here we are mainly focused on documentary practice in various shapes and forms, I think what it really did is that democratized the medium and photojournalism beyond what we ever could imagine, because photography used to be extremely expensive affair. I mean, just whatever cameras you're using now, this is just general. The film, the process, and the printing, everything was so insanely expensive that it largely disabled, or it didn't allow people from lower income countries or areas, and that's like majority of the world, to be storytellers. And I think that's the biggest thanks to the digital. Obviously it comes with, the whole digital era comes with its own set of problems and dilemmas, but I think what it really did is that it really democratized what we do beyond, I don't think anyone could have imagined. I don't know if you wanted to talk, I don't know what was your next slide, but you mentioned at the beginning the way cameras see. And believe it or not, and I'm sure you do know, a lot of photographers don't know how the digital sees. They don't know how, what's the difference between CCD sensor, CMOS, CMOS, and so on and so forth. And they basically don't know how cameras see, which, and that's my experience as an educator, and also, from some of my colleagues. And that's what brings us to the fact that photography is craft as well, which we can touch base later on. But I'm just curious, so how does the digital camera, in this case Fuji camera, sees? I'd really love to hear more of and we had this talk before, but for our audience, I'm just curious if you can guide us through this seemingly very, very simple process of us taking a shot, then something called debayering happens, and boom, we have beautiful image on our screen. So I'm just curious if you can guide us through a little bit through how Fuji sees the world.
Yeah, sure. I'm gonna take a little bit of a detour to get us there.
Please
but
do.
I made some little illustrations and some little things about cameras, just trying to be expressive and try to help people think about this. So earliest cameras that were made, so if we go back to the 1830s, 1840s, daguerreotypes, and some of the early process, the view camera was sort of the camera, right? And so you had the lens, you had a bellows, you had some kind of way, and then you had a plate on the inside of it. And these cameras were sort of ubiquitous back then. They were big, heavy, hard to take around. You worked fast, so you had to be very intentional in what you were doing. The film tended to be slow back in the day, so you had to use a tripod, you had to use a camera stand of some kind, and this influenced the type of photographs that were made, right? So you'll notice in these my little illustrations, right? They're going to be these angular lines coming through this camera. Well, this is what the film is seeing, right? So I can't look through this camera while it's making a picture. It's seeing the world, making a picture, and that's what it's capturing. If we then look at a different type of camera, so sort of the next development of cameras that came along were more of a viewfinder camera or a rangefinder camera, and those terms are oftentimes used very much sort of interchangeably. But I like to say that all rangefinder cameras are viewfinder cameras, but not all viewfinder cameras are rangefinder cameras, right? So a viewfinder camera is any camera that you look through a viewfinder. that's separate than the actual lens that's taking the picture. So here you'll notice in my drawing at the top, there's that line going through with a little arrowhead on the end of it. Well, that's sight path. So that's your eye seeing, and that's what you see. You're seeing through a little window up on the top of the camera, whether it's, a camera like this that has the little window on the side of it here that you look through, or it's, a much larger camera like a Geographic that has a little viewfinder up here on top and a rangefinder on the side of it here, right? So this is where the rangefinder is the actual focusing method and how it focuses. So this uses your vision, it splits your vision. So you look in the top of it, it actually splits your vision and then it makes a triangle. And by lining up that image is how you actually focus it. So that's what's the rangefinder. So technically, this is a viewfinder, rangefinder camera and a Geographic, right?
Yep.
Problems with these cameras, they have parallax issues. So if you're close to something, you may not get what you actually see because the lens sees something slightly different because in a different position. They tend to be limited in what lenses they're good at, right? Because if you're looking through a viewfinder and it's got some sort of frame lines projected in there, how do they move? What do they do? And I have some examples, we'll show this more. But street photographers, conflict photographers, all love these type of cameras because they were small, lightweight, quiet, compact, or they could be such cameras. If we look at an SLR camera, and there's two illustrations here because one's got the mirror down for viewing, and one's got the mirror up for actually making a picture, right? So to me, an SLR camera is a Swiss Army knife of cameras. It's really good at basically everything. So macro photography, long focal length lenses, it does all those things really well because you're looking through the actual optic. To me, the downside of an SLR type camera is lens vision, right? You're seeing through a lens. So you're seeing at the aperture of that lens, you're not seeing the way that your eye sees. So with that rangefinder or viewfinder camera, and you'll see this in the illustrations later, is that you're seeing like you put a window on the world. So if you kind of take your hands and make a frame and look through it, that's the way a rangefinder sees it. It's just kind of cropping out a window. An SLR camera, you tend to get a little bit of tunnel vision because you're looking through a lens. You're seeing the world the way a lens is. And one of the things that oftentimes happens with young photographers starting out, or even more advanced photographers, they buy a zoom lens, right? Because SLRs are great with zoom lenses. You tend to look at a frame and go, what can I remove from this frame? How can I make it cleaner? How can I get rid of things? So you tend to zoom. Where with a rangefinder camera, you're actually seeing what's in your frame and what's outside your frame. And so you tend to think a little bit differently with those cameras. And to me, it's a more additive because you see things moving. You might see someone coming into frame, and that's why Cartier-Bresson loved them, because it was predicting those moments, predicting action, being able to see outside that frame. And if we look at, say, a mirrorless camera for an argument's sake, it's got two different light paths. So we have the light coming in through the lens, striking the sensor, and that giving a feed out to the EVF, to the electronic viewfinder, which is like, having a little TV in there. So it's seeing what the camera is seeing. So there's no issues with parallax, but we can do cool things with this. If you want to shoot black and white, you can see the black and white scene. If you see the exposure. So if you're in a tricky exposure scene or you're in the dark, the amplitude, the camera can see places where your eye can't see. There's not enough light for you to see, but looking through the camera can see detail because of the ISO, because of the way the system works. It really creates an interesting, different way of seeing the world and really a WYSIWYG kind of experience. So you get to learn a little bit more. It's live view. So as you see something changing, you change the exposure, you see the effect in the finder. As it gets brighter, as it gets darker, what's going on. If we take this sort of one step further, we can look at these things. And the big picture is actually, I photographed the ground glass on that Geographic. I set up a little scene, which is in the upper right-hand corner, of some flowers in my studio, and then photograph the ground glass to show you what the camera sees. So something here like this view camera, the image is actually upside down and backwards. And that's really kind of an interesting thing. It separates that composition in the subject from what's really there. And so it makes changes your brain. It's kind of like you're standing on your head doing yoga and looking at the world. And I remember the first time I saw this, I remember the first time taking an 8x10 Deardorff camera out in the field, setting it up, putting the dark cloth over my head and looking at the world through it. The world looked amazing. Everything looked beautiful, seeing it projected on this big television in front of me, basically. So it's really kind of cool. But these kind of things can change your perspective and change the way you think about things. I once had a photographer friend tell me, you know, he takes a print that he loves, makes a print of it, leaves it sit in the studio for a week. If he still loves it after a week, he then takes it and flips it upside down and leaves it in the studio for a week. If he still likes it the second week, when it's upside down and you can't really tell what the subject is, he thinks it's a keeper. So it's just some interesting little things that's the way a view camera makes you see the world. And if we look at like a rangefinder camera or a viewfinder camera, right, we have the image on the left where we can see the picture, we see the frame lines that are telling us what we're going to capture. But you also can see the softbox in there that's lighting the scene. You can see artwork on the background. You can see all kinds of things that the exposure of the picture doesn't give you in that scene, right? So we can see outside of our actual frame and how that looks and how that feels in the world, but nothing there in that frame is really sharp focus. The depth of field doesn't really apply to that because the way that those cameras see. So it's really kind of a neat thing, seeing outside that frame, you know, action, conflict photographers being able to predict what's going on, zone focusing, you know, potentially too with these cameras, being able to set them up to do different things. They're really kind of powerful tools for a lot of journalists. And just as we moved in then to SLR cameras, right, we had some cameras that were early SLRs that didn't have a prism on top. And so those are interesting because you actually see the image is reversed left to right on this. That in me making a picture of the ground glass on that camera, actually it's reversed left to right. So those can be a little tricky. So like a Rolleiflex camera is really cool. You can actually take and you can shoot on an angle and shoot perpendicular to you because you're looking down the top of the camera. But these are some of the things. You have to remember that those cameras are reversed left to right. You go to swing the lens and you swing it the wrong way as you're trying to frame something up. So it's just a different way of functioning and working that may or may not be good for you. And if we look at a mirrorless camera, you'll notice here that me photographing, sorry, this is not a mirrorless, this is actually a 35mm SLR camera. I'm jumping the gun here. You know, it's actually seeing that world and, you know, how it looks and where it goes. And you're seeing the depth of field, right? We're seeing through both screens that the depth of field of the lens, we're getting that lens vision, what's in focus, what's not in focus. And if we take this now and go to a digital world and go to a mirrorless camera, basically it's the same picture. So it's kind of redundant to have it, that what I was seeing in the finder is the same thing that I was seeing on the sensor when I took the picture. So it's really kind of an interesting way to see it. I can control that. I can do all of this in one easy step. And if I look at there, this just as an example, this is actually one of our mirrorless camera that I shot quickly, right? What you see though is the effect of the TV, right? Because the screens, the contrast ratios, everything that they do, oftentimes tones might be a little bit blown out. So the little bit of white on the tips of those flowers from the light really isn't as bright as the viewfinder may have made it seem to be, but you know, it's all stuff that I can recover, all stuff that I can get back if I look at it as an actual image. But you were talking about earlier demosaicing and the way that that works, right? So, you know, all digital cameras, they have little individual photo sites. And those photo sites either see red, green, or blue. And then generically speaking, there's more green than red or blue, right? So if you look at it as thirds, it's not 1/3 green, 1/3 red, 1/3 blue. It's more like half of them are green. And then of that remaining other half, a quarter are blue, a quarter are red. And that's how the sensor actually works and how it sees light. And then, so it captures that light information through those pixels. You basically end up with a mosaic. So think about going anywhere where there's a mosaic in a museum in New York City in the subway, if you stand really close to it, how do the tiles look? You know, you see the color of the tile. If this is a green tile, that's a blue tile, that's a red tile. Back away from the mosaic, and what do you get? You see the colors blend, the edges go away. So the demosaicing process basically is taking that data and it's blending it, taking and giving you RGB information at each pixel site versus just green information, just red information. And different companies, most companies use something called a Bayer pattern, which has in a column, okay, so columns are vertical, rows are horizontals. So if I pick a particular column on a Bayer sensor, it's going to have green in it. Every column, every row has green in them, but every other one is either green and red or green and blue. So when you look at the map of how this goes, you've got green, green, red, green, green, red, if I'm going across a row. And then on those in-between ones that don't have the reds, that's where the blues will be. The blues will be offset from the reds. So there's never red, green, blue on the same row or the same column. And if you quick make a little thing, and maybe we'll do this in a future talk, because this is something I think probably people are interested in, I can make a quick little schematic of this, where if you look at a line and how it breaks things up, you might get jagged lines. So if you zoom into 100% or 200% in your pictures, you might start to see where something, if you had a red object end where there's no red pixels, there's no data, it doesn't see it. So it would just kind of maybe mush out and maybe be jagged right there and not be a smooth transition. We tend to use something on our cameras called X-trans sensors. And we, from our film days, it's a more random pattern. So it's a bigger pattern. Bayer tends to be a 3x3 pattern. So it's a like a tic-tac-toe grid, basically, in how it works. Ours is more of a 6x6 to 9x9 square grid that we use to interpret that data and pull it off the camera.
So you're saying that with your pattern, there's a little bit of less guessing or guesstimating, if I can use
well,
that's the right
there's
word.
more scattered data. So we have on the Bayer pattern, there's red, green, and blue in every column and in every row. So we have more color information, more randomly scattered than in the even patterning of Bayer. So the hope and the intent is that because of that, the color resolution becomes higher. That's the hope of it.
Got it.
From our engineers, at least that's the hope, that they can take that more random color pattern to help reproduce and help be less sort of confused, make sharper edges in things, see more varied color than you can. And I think the way to show it is I'll come up with a graphic for next week, next month, actually, when we talk about lenses. I'll throw that in there because it is kind of important when we talk about lenses, is resolution and how much you can see. So it's only just one piece of the chain, right? A lens can resolve huge amounts of data, but if the sensor can't actually discern any data in that spot, it doesn't matter. It's not going to make anything on the sensor. So I think that's really important to talk about.
And there's a question from Paul Marotta.
Okay.
Would like to talk about Fuji sensor aesthetic and how it sees. I'm just reading his question.
Mm-hmm.
So, excuse me. So we have to talk about Fuji sensor aesthetics and how it sees. I was out shooting with a friend many years ago, and we shot the same thing at the same time on the ocean front. And I said to her, "I like your palette better than mine. What am I doing wrong or differently?" And she said, "Nothing. Your problem is you're shooting a Nikon, and I have a Canon. Nikon colors are too saturated and dense and thick in their sensor. I have and still do shoot Nikon, but if someone were to consider a switch, how would you describe the aesthetic differences?"
Wow.
I mean, it's a $64,000 question. I can, do you mind if I take point on this one? Because
take point on this one.
I think bottom line, other than what I actually didn't know these details about your sensor and Bayer pattern sensors, which are obviously make perfect sense. But when it comes to me, when it comes to my own choices, I have several criteria. And those I have to mention because even if they don't concern aesthetics, first for me, it has to be ratio between value and money, because we are all practitioners, we make a living out of this, and we have to take it into account. Second, equally important, which I mentioned before, is the size of the package. I find that because I travel a lot, well, except this year, when I'm grounded like most of us, but I travel a lot. So for me, the size of the package is, I would even dare to say, eliminatory aspect of my gear. I think whatever manufacturer you go for these days, the quality of images is right there. You know, they're all good. They're all going to produce amazing imagery from the technical point of view. But size does matter. And I think the size of the, like I said, the size of the package for me, it's basically eliminatory. When it comes to aesthetic difference, I think that's very subjective. And for example, I never liked, I've shot with Canon a lot. Then I tried Nikon. Now I'm with Fuji. I think it's very, I was with Pentax in the meantime. So I went through basically all the manufacturers there are around. So I think that's largely a subjective decision. So I don't think it's someone that, you know, something that can be like you know, on a brochure of camera manufacturer. So really, how would I describe it? When it comes to Fuji, I'm a current user of Fuji. So for me, I'm happy with it, and I'm happy what I can pull off the photo, the raw file. I always shoot raw. So for me, all those emulations of various films in whatever manufacturer, for me, are only starting point. So for example, recently, and it's the first time I used that option, I used the classic Chrome simulation of that, because that's the look I was doing a piece for National Geographic. It was about migrants, and I looked at some old issues of National Geographic back in the day when they were shooting Chromes, and I kind of felt, this is very subjective, so I'm really putting out there my, you know, thinking process. I felt nostalgic about that look, and for me, and I know that you can achieve it with very simple post-production methods. But for me, it was really useful to have that option of that Fuji offers, which is simulation of certain film stock. And I use that to have that preview when I'm shooting. And later on, when I would go to Lightroom, because that's what I use only, I use because Lightroom has options to match the color profile. I use that classic Chrome as a starting point. So that was part of my you know, beginning of toning of the image. I would apply that same film stock in Lightroom from Fuji, and then I would work my way around, because it wasn't, I didn't want, you know, there were certain things I didn't like, maybe less saturation, more saturation, crushed blacks or not, and so on and so forth. But that was starting point. So I think it's really, really subjective answer, and I don't think there is a definite one. I don't know if you want to add to this, Justin.
Yeah, no, definitely want to add a little bit. I would say, Paul, it would depend upon where you came from. If you came from film and you shot a lot of film and you feel a little bit of nostalgia about film and wanting to kind of get back to maybe some of those looks, our cameras can do a lot for you in camera and give that to you kind of right out of the box. And so, yeah, you were using classic Chrome. Classic Chrome was inspired by the color slide film from the 1950s. That's really the color palette that they were going for when they came up with that simulation. Comparing that to something like classic neg, right? Classic neg, different color palette. It's a negative simulation, so the blacks aren't as deep, right? So like you're coming about classic Chrome, it's like a Chrome film. It can be very deep blacks to it. It doesn't have quite the tonal range that you might want. So having that flexibility, being able to change that, and we have lots of parameters in the camera that you can change that can affect these things too. but we got classic neg. We've got film simulation like Eterna, which was designed off of our motion picture film. And that, to me, it's extremely flat film simulation. I tend to shoot that one a lot. If I'm going to do a lot of post-processing later on, I'll shoot Eterna because I can see everything. It gives you a super flat file that you then can work with and can be really powerful in low light situations or other situations where you want to know what all's there in the actual file, where classic Chrome might not give that to you, right? And so it's a question of, is it feel, is it look, what are you trying to do? We're the only company around anymore that really has that foot of knowledge in the film era to be able to sit and kind of come up with some of those concepts. So I think we're in a unique position, and that's why we do those things. The other thing that I would say is, you know, in Lightroom and Capture One, you know, there's simulations of the film simulations. The ones in camera are actually slightly different because we have control of them. We have, you know, the way that we do things. So, for example, a simulation like Velvia, and I'm just talking off the cuff here, this isn't any inside information, because of the green and blue saturation, we might actually do something with the raw data coming off the file. So the green pixel data, we might actually do some work on that data before we demosaic to affect the saturations, to affect the color and how it looks. So that's the beautiful thing about us and the way our camera works internally, where if you're dealing with software like Lightroom or Capture One or whatever your favorite software is, they sort of have a recipe. They have step one, we do this. Step two, we do this to the raw file. Step three, we do this. So it could be different. Your results may vary. But it's one of those things I usually like to tell photographers, if you get a chance to try out one of our cameras, do yourself a favor, shoot some of the JPEGs and shoot some film simulations just for fun and see what you get. The other thing you can do on our cameras is if you shot something in RAW, you can actually go back in the camera and process it out. So you actually can make little samples and you can tweak exposure in the camera and even the tone curves in camera. So it's really kind of a cool little thing to be able to manipulate those files.
And talking about in-camera profiles, what I'm using here now to broadcast is a Fuji, it's XH1, and I'm using, I think it's Astia. Is it Astia? No, it's not Astia. It's one of the black, I forgot. It's
Acros.
One of the, yes, it's one of, yes, sorry.
Acros, I would guess.
So
yeah.
This is what I've been using. And also to mention the other profile is, I use Fuji for video as well, because it matches nicely with my other camera. And I use either, if I'm not going to do much toning, I also use Eterna, or I just shoot in F-Log, which is, for me, F-Log is perfect because it gives me the best tonal range, dynamic range, and it gives me the most space to tweak to match other camera, which may not be Fuji. So yeah, so that's a pretty, Justin, we are over an hour now, so I'm just gonna go to another question, so we don't, I'd like to answer them all before we finish. So the question is, the file size of the GFX series are enormous. Will that be reduced in future editions of GFX? Or would that mean as photographers we have to invest more in hard drives in the future? I'll just address this briefly, which doesn't concern Fuji, but it's one of those things, and I'm curious to see what you have to say, Justin. It's one of those things that contemporary photographers don't really take into account. Yes, we're not shooting film, so we don't have to buy film, but what we need to calculate is the size, the space for digital files. I'm currently having two large size Drobos to fit all my stuff, partially because obviously camera, I'm shooting RAW and I don't delete anything, absolutely anything, not even, you know, when I shoot my feet and stuff, because some clients ask for entire cards to be transmitted. And also because I shoot 4K, it's, you know, it's as with Fuji, the 4K, it's 200 megabits, which means it's pretty, I mean, they're massive, they're juicy files. Or I shoot RAW without a camera, I mean, video, RAW, so we're talking about terabytes of data. So it's just a heads up to anyone here listening who's into practice, try to build that in your, you know, business model, because as much as memory is relatively cheap, it's not free, And if you have any volume of work, if you multiply it by a couple of years, you're going to be ending up with terabytes and terabytes of material which need to be stored properly. I had drives fail. Everyone has. And so that's something that, from point of view of practitioner, please bear in mind when you're building your practice and budgets, because it's actually considerable expense. And we actually, as an agency, we always try to figure out ways to take that into account. Sorry, to you about the file size.
I mean, definitely, it is something to be aware of, right? So you're dealing with, in a GFX 100 or 100S, you're dealing with a 102 megapixel camera. And I just was bringing up on my Mac over here some files just to see how big they are. And it depends on how you're shooting. If you're shooting 16-bit color depth, obviously your files are going to be big, right? Because you're looking for tonal gradation. And as soon as you go from 12-bit in most smaller format cameras up to 14-bit, 16-bit, and get even more data, the data grows exponentially, right? The number of colors that can be reproduced at 2 to the 16th power is much more than 2 to the 12th power, 2 to the 14th power, right? So in just looking here, 208.5 megabyte raw files. So yeah, they're pretty big. That's an uncompressed, completely uncompressed 102 megapixel raw file. We have on that camera the capability, though, of shooting a couple different compression algorithms. So we have uncompressed, we have a lossless compression, and we have a compressed. So the full compressed at 14-bit, I want to say they're about 50 to 60 meg files, depending upon the scene. So they're much, much smaller. And then the next question everyone always asks, well, it's compressed. What am I missing, right? We actually did some testing on it. We were going to do, a colleague of mine, Michael, does these great From the Workbench videos that we put on every week. And he was going to do one on the compression algorithms and trying to show what the differences are. Well, we started doing a whole bunch of tests and we started looking at them and we couldn't see any differences. And so we emailed the engineers in Japan and going, okay, what's going on? Why are we not seeing this? And the truth of the matter is, unless you're going to really, really push around the raw files, you're probably not going to see it. So that's where you start to make the decisions at. That if you're a landscape photographer and you're taking a handful of frames, sure, shoot 16-bit, shoot uncompressed, because you're probably going to be stacking frames. You're going to be maybe stacking exposures, being multiple processing something to bring out sky. Not a journalistic environment. Journalists tend to shoot a lot more pictures. So I would say, as a journalist, feel free, set the camera uncompressed, whether it's full compression or a lossless compression. It's going to cut that file size down a bit, but it's a different beast. It's a different way of thinking. It's a different way of working. Memory cards, yeah, the technology's expensive. They're reusable. So that's a good thing about it. And hard drives, right? Hard drives are kind of our new processing and our new film. So, there's a cost associated with that side of it. But I would say don't hesitate to use some of the compression settings, because it can really cut down. I mean, a 50 meg file versus a 200 meg file, that's a lot of compression. And it really can save hard drive space. If you're working remotely, you can't download, you have other issues. You have an older computer and you're looking for ways to solve that. But 50 megapixel camera does sort of the same thing, and you can end up with about a 25 meg file out of a 50 megapixel camera. So it's unfortunately kind of the way the technology is driving, with more and more resolution, bigger and bigger files. But that's the question. Do you want the bit depth? Do you want the information? Or are you willing to let go of some of it? That's really the question you have to ask yourself.
I personally always go for as the maximum what camera can give me, because I just want to get the max out of the camera. Having said that, and for all those pixel peepers outside, so much you can see when you're looking at 100% on your screen. That's not really real, because if your primary output is print, either prints or magazines, none of that is going to show up in the print. And trust me, and I printed massive size of pictures on inkjet, magazines of brilliant printing, as well as books. So none of those things that you peep on your 100% is going to be visible. So I actually never look at my pictures at 100%. because just it's not natural. But here's another. I think we have time for one more question from which it's a tough one. So it's from Rafael, and he's saying, I have always photographed with Canon or Nikon and had my first experience last year with Fuji, specifically the X-T3. I was really bothered by the X-trans sensor issue in low light situations. I started noticing color leaks between objects. And when I tried to edit the RAW in Lightroom, it was not possible. So I had to start converting the files in proprietary converter. And so I temporarily gave up on the X-T3, even though I love the size, lightness, and speed. I'd like to try the medium format Fuji cameras, but I still think that they are as big as the competing mirrorless and also a bit slow in sense of frames per second. So I'm just going to say one thing. Your issue with Lightroom was probably that you didn't update your camera raw converter in a Lightroom. So there are certain, depends on your version of the camera raw on your Lightroom. So that's probably that. For the rest, Justin?
I'm going to jump in here quick. The other thing to check, Lightroom, unfortunately, depending upon when this was, exactly, Lightroom's defaults, particularly for sharpening and noise reduction, are generic settings. The first thing I usually do is make sure I get those sliders down to 0. They tend to apply a bit too much sharpening and a bit too much noise reduction to our files by default. That's something to check. The other thing is I would also look at other processors. Capture One, I think, does a better job in certain circumstances. Our medium format cameras aren't using X-trans. They're all using bare sensors, because the engineering X-trans for that big of a sensor just would add more cost to it. And we really didn't think that was necessary because of the resolution, because of the sensor size. There's some advantages there that we didn't think we needed X-trans to work on some of those issues. So it's a little bit different with those cameras. I mean, I would say to you with the question, I don't know which of the medium format cameras you've tried in our system. If you've tried the 50S, 50R, the 100 and the 100S are much, much faster. Their autofocus and the way that they work is faster. We're limited to about 5 frames a second. And that's sheerly because the amount of data we're passing through the system, right? That if you're looking at 200 megabits, 200 megabyte files, 5 of those a second, and start doing the math on it, how much data that actually is running through the camera, it's a lot. So that's kind of why there's that threshold limit on 5 frames a second on it. But depending on what you're doing, that might be fast enough, might not be fast enough for you. And if it's not, that's okay. It's maybe not the right choice for you for the system. And that type of camera might not be the right choice for you, where a 35 millimeter camera or a smaller format camera might be a better fit for that type of application.
And now that Rafael mentioned Lightroom, what do you suggest as the best or most compatible raw converter, so to speak, in order to get the best out of your sensors? And I'm actually curious about that as well.
We openly work with numerous manufacturers, so we pretty much have a fairly open door policy with anyone that wants to be able to work with our files. We will work with them. So I would say we're the closest with Capture One and with Adobe with Lightroom. That's probably our closest. From a professional standpoint, those are sort of the 2 industry standards there. But definitely those are the 2 that we're close with. There's a lot of other companies that we have relationships with that can work with X-trans files that do. Skyloom is one that I know that people love that software. But a lot of the other companies out there, as long as they can work with the X-trans files, yeah, they'll be fine for you.
And just the last question from Simona. She is from London. And let me just read. So, hi, I'm from London. I'm on a quest to buy my second camera. Always loved my friend's Fuji. How would I go about trying to test the medium frame Fuji camera? And she's in London. Is there like a test run, or what's the
What I would say to her is in Mayfair is the House of Photography. So there's actually a Fujifilm shop in London in Mayfair. I would suggest she pops her head in there and sees if they have anything there available to her. I have a call tomorrow morning with my colleagues in Europe, so I can also flush that out and pass that on through the team at VII if they can, to get it to you at a later date what the possibility is. But I know that they have cameras in the UK that are out there that are sort of in a test drive kind of situation. But I'll try to get a little bit more information on that. But my first stop would be a call to the House of Photography and see if what they have. I know they've been open and closed depending upon the restrictions in London, but I know with the space they have there and everything they have going on that they do have cameras there.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, everyone. Make sure to check in and tune into next session with Justin, which will be on May 4th, which will be more focused on lenses and optics. And I'm sure, sorry, there was another question. Okay. Make sure not to miss it. And I would like to finish with a small homage to, may I stop sharing your screen, Justin, for a second?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I'll do it. I want to share, sorry. Yeah, this is, I managed to get hold of, so in 2009, Fuji discontinued producing quick loads. For those who don't know, it's a 4x5 film, but it used to come preloaded in sheets, in envelope, which means you didn't have to have portable darkroom with you, but you could basically just, put a bunch of these envelopes, dark black envelopes, this size, and basically shoot very quickly, extremely quickly with your 4x5 camera. And so I bought, I think, one of the last batches, and it was 2010. I think you discontinued it in 2009. And I went to Pakistan with a very old, and I had to do a little bit of engineering on Sinar Handy, which is the smallest, the most compact 4x5 camera. But because it had this sort of, the only lens I had was extremely wide angle, 47. And so I went to Pakistan to shoot the story on refugees from Pakistan. It was a very violent period in the northwestern part of the Pakistan. So anyway, so this is the last shot, and this is my last shot on film, actually, and it was done with the Fuji 160 Pro S, something like that. Anyway, and later on it ended up on, I'm going to show that, and I'm going to finish with that. It ended up to be cover page of Telegraph magazine. Sorry, just give me a second. Why is it not showing? Hold on. Sorry. It was the cover page of Telegraph magazine. Let me just open it for you. So anyway.
And thank you for whoever corrected me on my London geography. I might be an Anglophile, but I'm not that good. It's actually in Covent Garden, not Mayfair. It's off by a stone's throw.
Yes, indeed. Anyway, so much for this session. So this was the cover of the Telegraph magazine, a dummy. Anyway, with that image. Anyway, everyone, thank you very much. Stay safe. If you look at the chat room, there is a link to the second session with Justin. Justin, thank you very much. It was super informative, and hope to see you, everyone. And there is another question, but we're going to copy that to you, Justin, for the next one. So whoever that was, we're going to address it later. Thank you very much, no Justin.
All right.
And thank you, everyone. Stay safe. Take care. Bye.